Good morning and good afternoon, and welcome to our webinar today, IT Visionaries with Rob Berger. Rob is a true thought leader with hands-on experience in automating large enterprise-class workloads and migrating traditional product development to DevOps. We're thrilled to welcome Rob here today and really excited for the discussion that we're going to have between Rob and Sistar CTO, Vankunupuraju, to talk about DevOps and next-gen technologies to support applications built on dynamic infrastructure and services, and how the bleeding edge is going to impact the enterprise. Sistar is disrupting the way enterprise manages IT operations. Today, heterogeneous and dynamic IT environments are growing in complexity with a shift to cloud and DevOps. IT Ops has to provide the visibility to the health and performance of business-critical applications. At Sistar, we unify lifecycle management for IT operations and a SaaS solution built for modern IT. We're headquartered in San Jose, California, and Sistar has over 1,100 end customers under management, supported by over 100 partners. Sistar has a breadth and depth through technology integrations, all of the major OEMs. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Rob Berger. Rob is the Chief Architect at Mist Systems, which is transforming the indoor public Wi-Fi experience with big data. He has been co-founder and CTO of Runa, which developed a SaaS solution for online merchants, and is president and founder of Internet Bandwidth Development, a consultancy specializing in backbone networks, access networks, wireless networks, and innovative web applications and services. Rob has been a principal or founder in several startup network services and equipment companies, and is a respected expert in IP networks and open source software, and has been on the advisory boards of companies including Compass, Cobat, Altion Web Systems, acquired by Nortel, and AboveNet. So I'd like to turn it over here to the Sistar Chief Technology Officer, Vankunupuraju.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks for joining today's session here. And I know you've been at DevOps and you've been practicing what has been getting preached in the market for a long time, and you come out with incredible background and experience in hands-on, transforming this business process of developing applications, what used to be in the traditional IT operations mode to a DevOps from a process perspective. And, to start with, it will be good to kind of give your little bit of a background in terms of what you have dealt with in the DevOps and, your own take on what, the DevOps definition is. There's a lot of buzz in the market, but the reality is it is not, what people think it is, and I think it'll be good to kind of hear your thoughts to start with and give your background and what you feel is DevOps.
Sure. Well, first, thank you for inviting me, and it's good to be here. So DevOps, it's one of those buzzwords that, when it first comes out, people don't really exactly know what it means, and people can apply anything they want to it to some degree. But I think that the core thing is to remember about DevOps is it's not really a role or a job description. It's really a philosophy and a way of doing things that really is a lot about the cultural transformation as well as the technology. And in some ways, it's nothing really new. I mean, I really look at it. So my personal definition is it's really applying the philosophy of agile and lean end to end. So for a long time now, we've got agile in the dev world, and that's really where the business and the development cycles are much more closely coupled, and they've broken down the barriers between the business world, side of things and the dev. But then in the past, what's happened is they then hit ops, which is maybe sometimes still in the old style of a waterfall model, and so the devs are operating at they're doing releases every 2 weeks or even faster, and then they hit ops and they say, okay, well, we can get that in the next 6 weeks or 6 months even. And so really DevOps in the end is breaking that final barrier down so that the flow, you're basically now doing agile end to end. The ops and the dev and the business are really all working together to create business results, and they're judged on the business results, not on, uptime is a foundation, but uptime is not your end goal. Your end goal is really to deliver a service to your customers. And so that's the core philosophy that needs to be done. And then the tooling and the actual processes need to reflect that. And that's really the big change. And the good news is we have these amazing tools and technologies. We have virtualization and cloud and big data and distributed systems, message buses. These are all tools that we can use to build systems, and processes like continuous integration and continuous delivery allow this kind of breaking down of silos and allow the ops to operate at the same speed as the dev Scrum cycles or Lean cycles.
Very interesting. I mean, I couldn't agree more. And I think if you look at the initial adoption of these agile methodologies and breaking that barrier in the ops world, predominantly took place in the web scale companies to start with, because they have a fresh, clean start to develop their applications. Their applications are started from ground up with the object models, and the coding for the object models started with fresh, clean slate, right? There is no baggage of old legacy enterprise applications that got developed in the past. So as a result, the initial adoption and initial curve of this DevOps methodologies and breaking those barriers started in the web scale companies. And when I say web scale companies, the social networking, social gaming, and the new age startups and all. But if you look at that from an enterprise perspective, right, the development stacks that the enterprises were using are no different from traditionally, from a coding perspective, whether it's Java applications, Perl or Python applications and all. What, in your mind, needs to change in the enterprises slowly to kind of transform, and move those traditional waterfall model applications to, the DevOps-oriented agile and lean methodologies, because the stacks are similar in nature, but the tools and the instrumentation may need to kind of overhaul. So what do you think?
Well, I think that what's really another aspect of that is really that the enterprise applications are being forced by the environment to become web apps, really, in the end, right?
Yeah.
That's really the big thing is, I mean, if we even look at like healthcare.gov, right? I mean, that was a case where they sort of started out and they were doing like kind of traditional IT, enterprise-style IT, and they completely failed because they were trying to deliver it at web scale. And then they had to really completely change that around and turn it into an agile, lean, end-to-end kind of a process. And they were able to turn that around in like 6 months when they brought in the team that had been doing, web-oriented. So on one hand, you have the issue of, the problem with enterprises, they also have so much legacy. So some of the issues are, really kind of figuring out how you can, it's like changing, the engine on an airplane while you're in flight, right? So the enterprise has a pretty big challenge because they're being forced by their environment, by their competitors, to turn into web companies effectively. Even if it's an internal app, it's being delivered on the web, and if you're a big company, that's still a pretty big scale. So I think the scale is one of the big issues. And so you really need to, one of the techniques you can do is like, start off small, like take some project that's maybe new where you have a little bit more greenfield and treat maybe some of the back-end services as, wrap it in a service model with, let's say a HTTP web front end, for an API, like a REST interface. And then, try not to touch that as much as possible and build all your new stuff using the more modern techniques. And again, it still could be using the same languages and stuff. Java and the JVM is still a pretty amazing set of tools. And just as a side note, if you're Java oriented, that means you're JVM oriented. It doesn't mean you're not stuck with Java. You can interoperate Scala, Clojure, JRuby, Python. There's very nice ways that you can still use all your libraries, but use more modern languages too. So these are some of the specific techniques. And then really what you need to do is come up with maybe a new project that's like delivering a web interface to either internal or external, and do that as a DevOps agile style end-to-end, and develop a team that's, has those skills that can then, once that's successful, can start training the other group and start migrating, chunk by chunk, your applications to this new style.
Very interesting, because if you look at, there is a myth that, the process of DevOps can only be employed if every piece of your stack is completely architected from ground up for the new year.
Right.
But at the end of the day, DevOps is all about agility in how ops is integrated into the agility on the development side, and that principles and the methods that are used by the web scale companies potentially can be explored on the traditional enterprise applications if they decompose those applications into microservices, smaller services where individual services can be existing in the same framework, but the deployment framework and the agility with which you are deploying those microservices, particularly when you are modernizing those applications to be mobile friendly, to be responsive design where a same user interface is getting presented on the web as well as mobile at the same time. And as you are modernizing, you can bring some of those interesting principles into the existing enterprise applications.
Yep.
What do you think the enterprises should do to kind of achieve that in terms of, first 1 or 2 or 3 steps that they should do?
So I think that, part of that is decoupling the you're decoupling the presentation layer, i.e. the web interface, from the business logic and your data. So, creating a multi-tier application which can evolve into a microservice application is a way that you can sort of migrate to that. So, and then you can start evolving the different components at different rates. They're no as long as you enforce APIs and use API versioning, you can, have these different subsections, either microservices or just separate subsystems, migrate or evolve at different rates. And again, a lot of times it's easier said than done, but this is a process that you can continually improve and get better at. And as you do that, you can start, replacing older systems with newer systems on a kind of a feature by feature basis. So it doesn't have to be. You want to avoid, big bang transitions. They usually don't work. But if you can make it so that you can evolve the different components and at different rates, that's really big value.
So the next question there, Rob, is the cultural aspects of developers are their cultural aspects are they move more aggressively to agility, right?
So I was going to actually so I think one of the things is we're focused a little bit on ops, but DevOps requires change from Dev and Ops and business, and so there are things so basically you have to break down the walls, break down the silos, and in an enterprise with an established culture, that can be very difficult. So one of the ways I've seen this work is to find people that want to do this in all the realms. Get a product manager and some devs and some ops people, and have them work together as sort of almost an experimental group to try to get the internal process for some project that has a little bit of standalone. And it doesn't require just changes from ops. It requires changes from the dev too. For instance, one of the best techniques. So one of the things is you need the dev to take responsibility of their app in production. They can't be like thinking they can just throw it over the wall to ops. That kind of behavior has to go away. And one of the ways that you do that is you have the devs rotate onto on-call service. So they need to be on pager duty or whatever your on-call system is at least some of the time for their applications. And they quickly learn that some of the decisions they make creates pain in the production side.
Mm-hmm.
And ideally, you can't force this on people. You have to get people that want to do this, but well, you could force it, but dangerous. But you want to make it so that they're learning that they can figure out, and then you can work together to figure out, okay, how can we make this so in the actual development code we're going to be able to reduce the kind of problems we're seeing in production.
Yeah.
So it's a learning cycle that has to feed back all around.
I think there is a myth that, when you kind of move to DevOps, the ops piece of the puzzle is completely, it is different, but it doesn't mean that the problems in terms of, just because you're spinning 10 more virtual machines, you're not running on one virtual, if you take a web scale application which is running in DevOps, just because you're spinning 10 more virtual machines for carrying your workload doesn't mean that the ops problem gone away. You may be losing memory, you may be losing connections on your connection pool, and you still need to kind of measure what's going on and why those things. So there is this myth that ops needs probably may change, but ops doesn't go away. So
I think ops becomes even more important, but it's a different kind of ops.
Exactly.
So one of the things you have to, so there's some real fundamentals, like, for instance, there's the philosophy, the goal, there's, another thing I want to differentiate is there's goals. This is a journey. It's not like something that you accomplish right away, but you want to have a destination. So, like, one of the key things is to automate all things. So, as an ops person, you're going to have to learn how to script, at least. You have to learn how to use tools like either Chef or Puppet or Ansible, any of these configuration management. You don't want to be, when you have to bring up a new service, it should require very minimal to no manual intervention. So there's some certain techniques, testing, testing of your operations scripts. That should be treated like code. You should have continuous integration for your operations code, just like you have it for your application code. And these are the kind of things that allow you to, get beyond having 10, 100 servers. When you're having maybe 1,000 servers, even though they're VMs, you can only manage that with automation. And so, as an ops person, you really have to become good with that. The other thing is that you have to, there's techniques that you can evolve into. For instance, one of the more interesting ones is once we go to cloud and virtualization, we can create servers that are effectively immutable. Instead of continually upgrading a server, when it's time to do an upgrade, you bring up a whole new cluster, test it offline, and then when you know it's good, you basically swap out the old for the new. And so that becomes another way to prevent a lot of the traditional problems that you have of just drift in servers and things like that.
Mm-hmm. And if you look at from a lifecycle management perspective on the ops side of the story, when you look at these virtual machines, those virtual machines are carrying the entire operating system stack and things like that. That means, do you see the need for the ops people to have two aspects? One aspect is to kind of look at how, in an agile way the code is getting deployed and how the machines are coming. The other aspect is to make sure that these virtual machines that are getting spun still needs to be, managed from a perspective of making sure that the right SSL stacks are there, right security patches are applied, and look at Heartbleed, look at, what happened with shell shock and all. There is there are elements of traditional operations that potentially needs to do to get visibility on what virtual machines are running, what are their current, stacks look like from compliance perspective, from visibility perspective, and what their role in the overall web scale that you are doing kind of a thing.
That's a very important point, that even though we're going into this sort of new world of automation and scripting and things like that, the experience and knowledge of traditional ops people is still critical. The dev people tend to not understand a lot of the issues that ops people really know in their heart. So, I always look at that people are only familiar with the level of the stack that they operate in, and they think that everything else below it is either trivial or magic. And so devs, to them, they think at the socket layer, and ops people know that there's all sorts of issues that you can have with, networking and, like you say, with the CPU memory and utilization. And this is why DevOps is about the ops and devs working together. So it's really important for the ops people to be working with the devs when they're designing their architecture, when they're designing their app, to work with them to say, look, if you do that, you're going to completely swamp these servers, or we're going to need giant servers, or things like that. So it's your knowledge of how these things work has to also be fed back to the devs, and the devs can help you with understanding how to write code and do scripting, and to automate your infrastructure.
Yeah. So from an operations perspective, if you look at how do they interact with businesses, right? And ultimately, at the end of the day, this whole thing is to kind of solve a business problem, right?
Right.
So what do you see the role of the new paradigm, and how that interaction with the business groups change in this new paradigm?
Well, so as part of that, it has to be that the ops folks are at the table when new products are being defined and designed. They should be part of the architectural team that's creating. They should at least be working with them together and coming up with, the actual infrastructure architectures should really be influenced a lot by the ops people, and then they have to be, buy into whatever the decisions are, because so you have to be there at the, in the beginning, and there's continuous cooperation and discussion throughout the life cycle of the product. And so really it's really DevOps, meaning that Dev and Ops are working together to do things. So it can't be, again, you don't want the throw it over the wall, or it's the IT crowd in the basement. They really have to be part of the whole process, and that they're going to be judged. The other direction is the business team, and has to convey to the ops people, these are what our business goals are. These are what we're going to be measured by, and this is what ops will be measured by. It doesn't matter if the system's up, but you're not delivering the customer's needs. So part of that is being communicated to by the business folks. You need to demand that you get insight into what the top line business goals are, and you have to build metric systems that can convey that both to you, and you want that also to your boss's boss, to the business side, to say yes, we're delivering our business goals, and they can see that in your dashboards.
Yeah, you're bringing a great point, and I think that that goes to shifting our focus towards enterprises, traditional enterprises, not the new age web scale startups kind of a thing. If you look at traditional enterprises where the operations teams are today are tower based, right? They have a network tower, they have a Windows tower, they have a storage tower, they have virtualization tower. These are all the IT admin people who are operating in each individual towers. In the traditional model of IT, where an enterprise app is developed and it is getting deployed, once 6 months, or new release is going to come. And if you look at those IT teams, right, and then apply some of these principles to those IT teams, how they need to kind of do, what technologies that they need to kind of deploy, what technologies that they need to transform. While the development is moving towards agility, the operations teams needs to kind of adopt new technologies. And what do you think that they need to do to kind of really transform themselves from a technologist perspective, from a visibility perspective, on how these applications are getting deployed into production capacity in terms of dev staging, pre-production and production kind of a thing?
Well, so again, I think one of the key things is first of all, to break down those towers, or in the literature we call them the silos, because that really, within a silo, you're sort of in your own little world, and they tend to turn into little kingdoms with their own internal measurements of performance, which tend to not be coupled to the performance needs of the overall company or your customers. So that's probably the foundation, and again, that's probably one of the hardest things to do in an enterprise. But it's really worth it, and when you come out on the other side, usually 99% of the people are much happier, because they feel like they're really delivering value. They're not just, delivering, a desktop. So that's at the philosophical level. You really want to make it so that you have an integrated. You want to make your systems reflect the corporate structure that you like, and so you don't want to have a siloed set of systems. You want to have a more horizontal set of systems. So all your metrics, all your reporting, all your management, it shouldn't be siloed. It should be horizontal, and you leverage those same techniques and the skills of the people across the entire stack, as opposed to these silos, which tend to turn into little fiefdoms and reduces communication.
Yeah. And I think a good example of that is like take an example of a web-based e-commerce application that is running in an enterprise, and as they move this e-commerce related website that a typical enterprise is really doing from a DevOps perspective, what you are saying is the visibility of the application and the services that compose of that application and the metrics that is driving that application are the important parameters that the operations people need to kind of see, not necessarily by individual infrastructure element level,
right,
but how those dashboards are performing. And can you elaborate those dashboards into maybe two kinds of, one is business metrics and one is operations metrics?
Yeah.
Can you elaborate that? What
that's important too, because so on one hand you need to create these business metrics, and you can only come up with them if you're cooperating and working with the business group to know what's important, the dev group to know that, because these metrics are going to, in most cases, come out of the application layer, not necessarily out of your low-level infrastructure layer. But then you still need to be able to monitor all the infrastructure, because that's like your foundation, right?
Yes.
So you have to still make sure your foundation is strong. You're supporting the applications is kind of like the walls and the plumbing and the things like that, and then the business is the overall house. You need to show that you're delivering a complete solution to the end user. So it could be anything from number of signups, purchases. Those are the kind of business metrics that you're going to get. And again, they're mainly coming out of the application layer. But then you need to, if you're seeing that, okay, look, we just had this glitch in the number of sales. Now let's dive down and see what's in the infrastructure that's causing that glitch in the sales.
Yeah, I think you brought a great point. Like the integrated stack visibility, right? Starting at the business metrics, and then one level below is the operational metrics that is driving the business metrics.
Right.
The operational metrics could be the number of VMs that that is powering each piece of the stack, and number of elements that are participating in each piece of the stack, right? I have a big data using Cassandra. How many node cluster is that Cassandra consuming today, right? What is the consumption looks like? Those are all operational metrics that you may derive at each layer of the application stack, and then one layer below that is the actual performance metrics and the lifecycle management of those individual elements, right? Is all these machines patched, all the web-facing machines patched to the current level,
right,
so that there is no security, loopholes that left out. So what you are saying is an integrated stack from business metrics all the way to the operations metrics is critical in the operations roles for the...
Yeah, otherwise you can't tell what's going on when there's a problem in any one layer of the stack or the business.
Yeah. Very, very, very interesting. So now that brings to the next paradigm. What do you think is the impact of this container framework and the Docker and the new container frameworks that are coming? Virtual machines are no longer the virtual machines that we used to see, and they're becoming more and more containers kind of a thing. So what do you see?
Well, I'm very excited about containers and Docker. I think this is the first big paradigm shift since VMs, and in some ways it may be even bigger, because I think it really is going to cause us to shift a lot of our provisioning techniques, and it gives us the power, some superpowers now as ops and dev. And I think it's a good time to be experimenting. If you have either a project, a little side project that's not yet mission critical, or you have the opportunity to maybe try things out for a little bit before you have to deliver something. It's a good time now to do that. I think it's not quite ripe for big production unless you have certain applications that make sense, or you have the luxury to potentially have a couple pickups along the way. The issues, so the containers themselves, the Docker, creating Docker containers is like really easy now, and you can. One of the immediate applications that I really strongly recommend using Docker is to create your dev environments. So one of the big issues you have, let's say you have a heterogeneous multi-node cluster to implement your app, right? You need some storage elements, you need some app processors, some web front end, and to for a developer to really play with it, it would be nice if they could have that on their laptop. And ideally, you want to use whatever you're using to deploy, let's say using Chef or Puppet or something, you should be able to use that to deploy the same stack onto your laptop versus a dev's laptop. Well, the ops people should have it on their laptop too. So one of the problems in the past is you could use like Vagrant or VirtualBox or VMware, but when you use VMs for that, let's say you want to do a VM per server type, that would you'd run out of memory on your laptop really fast. You'd have to allocate that much memory. But what you can do now is you have one VM, let's say one Vagrant box or whatever, and then you use Docker containers inside that, where you're now using a Docker container per server type. So one for your web front end, one for your app, so on. And you can kind of squeeze, because the Docker containers can sort of finely use the memory of the VM or whatever on your laptop. You can kind of squeeze it all in there with maybe a few gig of memory. Mm-hmm. So in a way, this is not the Docker way. The Docker way would be you'd composite each of those servers with multiple containers. Mm-hmm. Here you're using them as like virtual machines. Yeah. But I think that's a really good first step, and there's some nice tools now that make that pretty easy to do. Even on your Mac or something, you can use boot to Docker and build that whole kind of a thing with one VM.
It's very interesting, huh? If you look at, we both have been in the Solaris space for a long time. Solaris Zone.
Right.
If you remembered, long time ago. So how do you see, Zones was not accepted as a big thing at the time, and now the application frameworks and the new agility in what we are doing really matured to the thing to make this new container framework in the Linux. How do you compare and contrast this, what Zones used to do?
So I think part of it is, Zones came out before we really were comfortable even with virtualization.
Exactly.
So I think people just didn't have the mental model yet. The other big difference is what Docker really, in one sense, none of the pieces of Docker are new. It's just that they put it together, and I think what's actually kind of brilliant about it is the API is like it's sort of the Goldilocks of APIs for virtualization. It's just right. Basically, they just came up with a set of, one set of API that just makes it easy to do that, combined with kind of the way they did the compositing of containers. I think that was somewhat new as well, that you can sort of just, by using write on modification style file system is really what kind of put it all together. So I think we're going to actually, my prediction in the long run is the Docker API is going to become the universal virtualization interface. But that's in the future.
Yeah. Now, from an ops perspective at this point, it is still in the in the early adoption curve for the enterprise, right? You know, if you look at, my comment is around enterprises and enterprise adoptions to these new technologies. So the first layer I still see in the enterprises is how to break this traditional IT and traditional IT development cycles of long, development cycle before the application gets deployed. You know, any business application that a large enterprise is developing into and breaking that into services components and then making them incrementally evolve and move it into the DevOps kind of agility in the development and agility in the ops cycle, bringing them together and adopting that is the first wave of adoption before the second wave of adoption goes a little more deeper and then breaking those barriers even further down from a virtual machine to all the way to a container framework. Do you see that as the enterprise adoption?
Yeah, I think as we mentioned earlier, I think the enterprise is sort of stuck in the sense that it has legacy, and so you need to identify the areas that you can sort of push the evolution without disrupting your day-to-day operation. So that's the challenge, and I think that again it's identifying. So if you look at your roadmaps, identify the projects that can you can sort of create these new teams. So I think you can't have your entire staff become agile and DevOps, right away. But there are people within your company that are probably, really want to do this, and you can start creating sub-teams that can work on these more decoupled. So you have to figure out in your roadmap what you can decouple into more modular, either microservices type styles, and start by taking it off bite-sized chunks, and then evolve your team. Once you sort of have this spearhead team, they can then show some success, and then start helping to train other people that want to learn that. It's just like any kind of adoption cycle.
Yeah. I think from an ops perspective, I think if you look at it as the agility comes into the ops, the way that the VMs are coming into the picture for bringing these applications and all, they are coming in a dynamic way, and from an ops visibility perspective, all these shadow VMs that get spun and not accounted for and all, you need some visibility to create what each of these consumptions for each of these services are, and bringing that service, going back from an ops metrics perspective, being able to understand what each of those services are, how many VMs are getting consumed, what are these shadow VMs that are left out. So that needs a little bit of a evolution from an ops tools perspective. Do you agree?
Because
the traditional ops tools don't give that kind of a view, right?
Yeah.
You have to manually onboard the VM, you have to manually deploy the monitoring template, you have to manually deploy what you're doing, but that changes in this new world, right?
Yes, and that's very important. And if we look at the people that are, the best at this, I think Netflix is probably the canonical example. They came up with, they now call it the Simian Army, but originally it was the Chaos Monkey was the first thing. And when you first hear about this, you say, oh my God, how do you do this? And basically the idea is that they actually have software whose job is to randomly kill off VMs in their system, like just spontaneously without any notice. And if your system can't withstand that means your system's broken. You need to fix that so that because in the cloud and with virtualization, you have to assume that n number of your VMs are going to just go bad or have problems. So this forces that your architecture and your software and your infrastructure can withstand a certain percentage of VMs to go bad, and that you automatically recover, get back to the automate all things. And I think that's you have to make it so your automation is tied in with your dashboards and your monitoring and all your provisioning, so that eventually you don't have you want to know if there's VMs that are not supposed to be there, but you should have something that if it's unaccounted for, it should be killed. Like that's the goal you want to get to. But in the meantime, you need to be able to know what everything is doing.
Yeah.
I mean, that's foundational.
I think in the interest of time, my last question to you is, as you look at the enterprises, right? Not everything that they have, they wanted to move it to cloud, or not everything that they have, because there's traditional enterprise elements, whether it's warehouse database or whether it is your authentication systems or your PCI compliance data that you wanted to hold in your enterprise for whatever reasons, but at the same time, they have, consumer-facing, customer-facing components that potentially are, getting modernized to kind of be mobile-friendly and things. Some of those components are slowly moving into this, into the cloud aspects, right? Whether they operate a private cloud or whether they go to a true public cloud like Amazon kind of a thing.
Right.
So there is elements of integration that is coming into the play. And what do you see in this new world, and where you are combining the agility of the app development, agility of the development, the DevOps, where the ops is responding to this, but the infrastructure is getting federated between private and public clouds in a hybrid way. What do you see the operations tools requirements in that space for the true DevOps and IT ops, which is evolving from enterprise to kind of manage these hybrid environments?
I think that's super critical, because you want to again treat your app stack as this sort of cohesive system that you have cohesive visibility and automation of, again, from business all the way down to infrastructure. And in the modern system, you need to be able to manage, bare metal machines in your data center or other data centers, your private clouds and your public clouds. Your app stack should be able to transition that whole thing. Zynga was actually one of the first to really do this in a really integrated way, where they actually made it so that they originally started on Amazon, and then for economic reasons they got their own data centers, but they wanted to treat that with both the private data centers and the public as one system, and they had one set of consoles and automation, and they can migrate processes between those, and that's your goal. And the foundation of that is to have visibility. That you don't want to have like one dashboard that's your private cloud, one dashboard that's your your bare metal, another one that's your public cloud. It should be one dashboard that lets you see all of that. Very interesting. Great.
And thank you very much, Rob, for your time. I think maybe we can allow Aki, some questions from our participants here. Any closing comments before we take the questions, Rob?
No, just that I think this is a very exciting time for being in ops and being able to have amazing tools. It's the most fun I've been having in a long time.
Couldn't agree more.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Rob, again for joining us, and Varma as well. We have a few questions to close out the session. So the first is, what are some performance metrics for assessing the success of our DevOps initiative?
Well, I think that it gets back to the fact, in having some business metrics that are really the top-level metrics that you want to judge your operations. So, it's really somewhat specific to each enterprise's business, but it could be, being able to grow the number of users. It's going to be being able to process so many web pages. So again, it's somewhat specific, but you want to tie it to the business goals.
And then maybe, the equal thing below that is an operations metrics, probably from a perspective of number of VMs are consumed in each service layer that, each of the service that is composing of that application is comprised of, right? Whatever VMs and the performance metrics around those things as well, right?
Well, yeah, and then an interesting concept is that what people are discovering is that the key metric in an ops point of view is mean time to recovery. So this gets back to, because with ops, we have to, so our goal is, we're not going to always have 100% uptime, but if there's a problem, let's say a data center goes out or, some subsystem goes out, how fast can you recover? That's really, I think, and that should be something that you should be able to, that you have drills that you can actually present that as a, you want to know that before the problem happens, not after. So I think that becomes one of the big tasks for the obstacle, to really be prepared for the inevitable.
That's a good segue to the second question that we have, which is how DevOps tools can help being proactive in application monitoring to detect and mitigate problems before they occur.
So this gets back to now, so we've been talking a lot about business metrics, but to accomplish those business metrics, what does it take from the infrastructure? And how can you know that you're approaching a problem? So I think that trend analysis and being able to, again, have visibility, and to know that you want to know before the customer calls you that there's a problem. And ideally, you want to know, for instance, let's say they deploy a new app, you want to know that, for instance, oh look, the memory consumption is like unusually high. It's growing much faster than you'd expect. Things like those are the kind of things that having a great visibility into your underlying infrastructure can help you prevent or predict problems and be able to correct before they affect the customer.
It's very interesting that you brought up, just to kind of add to that, in the good old days, there used to be NOCs, Network Operations Centers, which are equivalent of, because you wanted to kind of see what's going on. In the new DevOps world, equivalent command centers where you really need to kind of understand how your application, how your services, and the infrastructure to support those services are all coming together, and be able to process all these events and that are coming from hybrid clouds or from your own application logs needs to come together to kind of really determine what it takes to kind of get a mean time to repair at a level that the businesses can take it, right?
Yeah. And I think another side of that is to give that visibility to the devs. So this gets back to the cooperation, because again, either the devs, so first of all, you want to have the devs be on call sometimes, rotated through. But also, you want to give the devs the information so that they can say, why is their app performing poorly, or why does their app need, 100 VMs? Can you make it so it only needs 10? If they could see the performance and the logs and the information as well. So, and then you want to expose higher order dashboards to your business people.
Exactly.
I think this is a good question to close with. We talked about what some of the key IT operations patterns and best practices that enterprises need to adopt to successfully transition to full-fledged DevOps. What are some of the highlights then?
Well, again, and we touched a little bit on that. I think it's breaking the silos between the groups, that there's much more cooperation between and interaction continuously. Maybe even having stand-ups together, things like that. But being able to just be able to share the data between the groups.
Maybe on the application side, probably to add to that, Rob, maybe if you look at the traditional application we touched upon, like how can this application morph into the new modern way by decomposing the application into maybe a few services, right? Yeah. And each service can individually can get upgraded as often as one wants, without majorly impacting the overall experience for the business user, because you're evolving the application in a component and a service layer level, and that potentially brings those applications more closer to the agility that is needed by the business users these days.
Yeah. So the more that you can decouple and have independent chunks of software that can evolve on their own, but you still want to expose them so that you can roll up the monitoring and see what the interactions are between these things. And so part of that again is allowing the devs to create monitoring, basically metric points inside their application. So, for instance, at the API level, let's say you're creating a REST service, there should be metrics of all the REST calls that are also being injected into the same common monitoring system. So things like StatsD and stuff like that are a great tool.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you again, Rob, for joining us today.
My
And
pleasure.
thank you, Varma. This is going to conclude the session. Thank you all for joining.